Leaders meet to reset relations. Positive feedback and financial pledges have come out of the EU-AU summit in Brussels. But how much does Europe's troubled past in Africa complicate its modern-day struggle for peace and prosperity? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the African-European relationship. The European Union and African Union would like to portray their ties as a partnership between equals. But the legacy of colonialism and their rich-poor divide cast a very long shadow. Former imperial powers have long been accused of taking a paternalistic, patronizing attitude towards African nations. Current AU leader and the president of Senegal has been hoping for a reset.
This is the summit of a new start, of a renovated partnership. I hope that our talks will bear fruit on all major themes, be it peace and security, the fight against terrorism, but also the financing of African economies. With the reallocation of special drawing rights and many other issues, I think we will be able to reach a new start. Africa, which has borne the weight of history for long enough, at last intends to set itself free from its burden, to be accepted and respected as a fully involved participant to new dynamics, presiding over world governance and forging the common destiny of humanity. This is the spirit that animates us when we come to this summit in Brussels.
Well, in the late 1800s, European powers raced to claim African land as their own. Here's how the continent looked in 1914, just before World War I. France controlled much of West Africa. The British held pockets of territory in the east and south of the continent. Belgium controlled the immense wealth of the Congo, while the Germans, Portuguese, and Italians also administered various regions. Now, colonial rule was brutal and oppressive, and throughout those decades, it both impoverished and destabilized the continent. But after 2 world wars devastated Europe, and as nationalist movements in Africa emerged, it was no longer feasible for European powers to maintain their overseas colonies. So by the 1960s and 70s, most nations had gained independence, some peacefully, like Ghana, others through years of war, like Algeria. But since then, most theorists argue that neo-colonialism has been driving Europe's relationship with Africa. That's a process where stronger nations use political and economic pressure to wield influence and power in less developed countries. This includes things like bribery, propping up corrupt leaders, giving loans with strings attached, and fostering aid dependency, all to maintain access to Africa's raw materials and to further European interests. And the continent faces numerous other challenges as well. It bears the burden of several deadly diseases, including malaria, cholera, Ebola, and HIV. It suffers from a fragile healthcare system and inadequate access to medicines and vaccines. For instance, only around 10% of adults are fully vaccinated against COVID-19. Globally speaking, Africa has high levels of poverty and hunger and lower levels of education and development. There's political instability, with coups making a comeback as military leaders seize power by force. And of course, terrorism persists, manifest in groups from Boko Haram to Al-Shabaab. Well, on the day the summit kicked off, France announced it was withdrawing its forces from Mali after almost a decade battling Al-Qaeda and Daesh-linked groups in the Sahel. The view from Mali's military junta is that the French mission was ineffective. French and European troops will now relocate to Niger.
The Malian army has been strengthened and reorganized. The problem now is to know whether it gets its orders from the junta and if it's easing up on the fight against terrorism. It's a Malian problem. It's no longer a French problem.
Well, if the French are effectively washing their hands of Mali's problems, there's no shortage of other distant players waiting in the wings. Russia has provided Mali with military advisors and mercenaries to help deal with its security challenges. China, meanwhile, has been pumping billions of dollars into infrastructure projects across the continent. And Turkey is also increasing cooperation in trade, defense, and education, particularly in East Africa. So could Europe be at risk of losing its influence on the continent, and will the EU and AU be able to turn a fresh page on their relationship? To discuss that and more, I'm joined from Mali's capital, Bamako, by Samake. He is a former Malian diplomat and presidential candidate. From London is French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani, who's written extensively about the legacy of European colonialism in Africa. And completing our panel from London as well is the director of the Africa program at Chatham House, Alex Vines. Thanks all so much for being with us. Alex, first, if we can, let's get a better sense of why this EU-AU relationship really matters. I mean, we know both China and Russia are playing a much bigger role on the continent than in years prior, but does that actually threaten the EU, and what could the EU potentially miss out on if it doesn't strengthen ties?
Well, firstly, the history between Europe and Africa has been deep, sometimes too deep because of the imperial colonial project. But it is the near abroad of Europe, particularly West Africa. It's extended neighborhood, so it's very strategic, I would argue, for both continents. And what's happening now is that you've got more and more countries being involved in the African continent. That's good for Africa. And so you've had a spate of summits, of which the EU-Africa summit is the latest, but there was a China one earlier this year. Later this year in August, there'll be TICAD 8. That's a Japanese version of this. They'll have about 8. And then at the end of the year, we have a second Africa-Russia summit, and probably the second US-Africa Leaders Summit. So that's a lot more choice for Africans. And the EU should not be complacent about the African continent. It'll have to work harder. It can't rely on history any longer.
Okay, but it'll have to work harder to what end? What does Europe really risk losing if it doesn't, build stronger bridges with Africa?
Well, common prosperity. The Europe business model will require more interconnectedness, including strategically a shortening of supply chains. COVID-19 and the pandemic has shown extended supply chains and choke points are not good for European business. And so Africa, particularly West Africa, makes a lot of sense for industrialization, widening pharmaceutical production, circular migration. I mean, there's a long checklist, I think, of advantages for Europe to have a better and sustained partnership with the African continent.
Okay, Samake, how welcome are European partners in Africa? I mean, who really is, do you think, the better or the best partner for Africa? Are there any that are more heavily invested, for example, in helping to raise the overall, standard of living for Africans? Or is there that fear still that too many foreign partners are too much interested in what resources are at stake, and that neocolonialism is a little bit too strong still to make a healthy, beneficial partnership at this point?
Andrea, it has been said that the 21st century is Africa's time, and our partners better engrave this into their new thinking. Africa is not escaping anyone. Africa is standing on its own feet and needs respect and want a change in the dynamic of our relationship. And there have been signs already that our European partners, particularly in the case of Mali, France has not yet included this into their thinking. They have to change, not just by saying we want to change. We want this change to be effective, to be tangible in Africa. We want, first of all, the return of our dignity. We want to claim control of our destiny. That's what Africa wants. That's what Mali needs. And this is a new dynamic. We don't want to bend to the injunctions of former masters. We are past that level. Leaders like myself, we are not in the colonial conflict anymore. We have to have a more forward thinking and making sure that our relationship is a win-win relationship and respectful relationship instead of the paternalistic relationship that French want to impose on French Africa. It is not going to work. So we have to make sure we don't want anyone to leave Africa. We welcome everyone. We want to work with all of our partners. The more the merrier, because it gives us more options.
Okay. Yeah, let me ask you, though, quickly, because I need you to further explain with some examples, some more detail about how the legacy of colonialism still kind of overpowers the relationship and why that is bad for Africa. Because you will hear some argue today that the past has to be left behind. You can no longer argue that it is former colonial powers that are making problems in Africa today, that it's African nations themselves that have failed to take the control that they can take control of, and that this is the problem going forward.
Well, today, that is no longer the claim we're making, that they are our problem. We are standing on our own feet, and this is hard to swallow by the ego of former colonial powers. That is the reality. The reality is Mali, I'm speaking for Mali, I'm not going to speak for Africa. Mali wants to stand alone. Mali wants to stand on its own feet and look straight in the eyes of our partners as equal partners. We do not want to live in a paternalistic relationship with France anymore. And that is hurting because it's a change. We welcome our relationship with France. We did not ask France to leave Mali. We said, you can stay here under our terms. If you can't live in our country in our terms, well, so long. And that's the attitude of the new generation in not only Mali, in many countries in Africa. Okay. So we want change in attitude. We don't want our masters to come back. We want partners to come to Africa. We do business, and Africa is open for business.
Okay, let me ask Nabila. I mean, you do hear some of the same sentiment that Ye was describing out of Algeria as well. Help us better understand why it's still not equal at this point. What is it that France in particular does to make this paternalistic attitude and create this complex, really, between the parties involved? What is it that is happening that creates that complex?
Well, I think what is pretty clear is that there is still very much a scramble for Africa feeling to the whole geopolitical situation across the African continent, not only from France, but the European Union. And African leaders launched that two-day summit in Brussels on Thursday. And Europeans are effectively trying to convince the African guests that they are the most reliable partner in the face of tough competition on the continent, especially from China and indeed Russia. So the EU will now use the summit to roll out an initiative aimed at generating 150 billion euros in public and private investment funds in Africa over the next 7 years. And the EU will effectively launch this plan, which is part of the EU's new Global Gateway project. And this is effectively a 300 billion euro worldwide investment program, which is meant to rival anything that China and indeed Russia can offer. But it has to be said that inevitably, the focus is on security issues, which are dominating discussions, including the presence of Russian mercenaries on the continent, including in Mali. So not only is Moscow making life difficult in Ukraine, but mercenaries from the Russian paramilitary group Wagner have been popping up across Africa too. And Western nations effectively fear that Russia is stepping into the vacuum left by the withdrawal of countries such as France, and Wagner mercenaries are said to be already on the ground in Mali, even though the military junta.
Let me ask Alex about that quickly. I mean, the fact that Mali is employing these Russian private military contractors, you know, instead of or in lieu of the French troops that are now leaving, what difference does it make? What difference does it make to the Europeans if, you know, Russian mercenaries are fighting instead of French and European troops?
Well, the Malians are saying, well, the Russian troops might be more effective than the French and other European forces that are there. I'm not convinced. I think this is politics related to the junta in Bamako. As you will remember, there's been 2 coups over the last 18 months in Mali. and this is more about protecting their interests rather than providing an improvement of public goods, services and development and security for Mali. That's my view. And I think in the end, the issues in Mali are much deeper. They are about the post-colonial nation building project in Mali that is deeply in trouble. And so security is not the solution here. It's better government, it's accountable government, it's getting public goods and health and other services across the country effectively, as well as combating the security issue. Parts of Mali have not been really well governed at all since independence. So I don't think Russia's a solution. And my final point about Russia is they don't have the deep pockets, nor I believe the longer-term strategic interest in the stability and prosperity of West Africa. This is European near abroad and neighborhood. It's not Russian. And so the Russian engagement is as much about geopolitics and offsetting pressures related to Ukraine and elsewhere. And so I don't think the Russians are the solution to this particular crisis.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to get your thoughts on Alex's assessment there, because it is directly about your home.
That's exactly the kind of thinking that we want to prove wrong. It is not about the deep pocket of European or any nation that is going to pull Mali out of where we are. That is the lack of understanding that actually our partners are displaying, because nothing will work in Mali if we don't build first and foremost a political stability. And that is what the transitional authorities are requesting, that we need a little more time to build a better electoral system, to build, to have the necessary reforms so that we can have a better governance. And yet there have been most pressures that we should hold elections when it is not possible and not in the best interest of the people of Mali. And that's where we claim control of our own destiny, because no one knows what works for us better than ourselves. No one has the best interest of Mali at heart than the Malian people. So let's work together. Let's find a way to find a Malian solution instead of external imposed solution on us. We need the Russians now. The Russians are making a dent within 3 months, where French and 14 to 30,000 troops have failed to circumvent jihadism or the violence in the country. And this is very frustrating for the people of Mali. We have invested emotionally in the presence of 30,000 troops, of Barkhane, of Takuba, but yet there has been no tangible result on the ground.
Understood. I just want to hear from Alex quickly. Does that make sense to you? Because it's not exactly in line with your analysis of the situation at present.
No, my view is that there's a crisis of state building in Mali, and that you've got an elite in Bamako that has not been able to provide security and effective development. And so you have large areas of Mali that the state has been pretty inexistent. And those have been filled in by others, at times militias, at times jihadist groups. And so I don't have confidence that the junta in Bamako is a solution to this.
Okay.
And so I do agree that there needs to be Malian solutions to Malian problems, but I'm very doubtful about this junta being that pathway.
If I may break it to you, Alex, the reality is we partner with the MINUSMA, we partner with Barkhane and the French troops to get rid of all of those violence and jihadism and terrorists in the northern area for the past 9 years. And the result is undeniable. We know that it hasn't worked. That's why we have asked for other partners to come. And this should not be an issue for anyone who is looking for a solution. The solution that we have tested has failed. We needed to evaluate the security strategy that has been brought up on. We needed to make sure that we implement something that will bring peace and stability. And as I said before, Alex, what we need the most in this country is not more boots on the ground. It is not more guns in the field. What we need is first and foremost political stability. What we need is institutional arrangement that will allow Malian to thrive and to be able to provide for the needs of the people, south and north.
Okay.
Making sure that that's our plan. And we hope that you guys will join and come to understand this and join us in providing stability, political stability first, and then we can secure our borders and go for a thriving Mali, which is in the best interest of everyone.
Okay, let me get back to Nabila. I would like to get your thoughts on the exchange you've heard, but I also want to ask you, as you know, African security, as well as contingency plans for climate change have been discussed at this conference as well. Neither has been properly shored up. And there is talk now that there could be, you know, a huge wave of migration again toward Europe, just as the result of climate change issues and security issues. And security, you think, is first and foremost the issue. I mean, how much is that properly being addressed now between the EU and the AU? Because that is the bomb that could explode in the near future.
Well, yes, absolutely. And I tend to agree with Alex's analysis when he says that the other candidates seeking to fill any possible vacuum, and especially power vacuum, on the African continent include groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, of course. And these are exactly the kinds of groups that France and other EU nations and allies went to Mali to fight, for example. But there has been, of course, a spate of military coups across the continent that has given those extremist groups a fresh life and indeed a chance to reconsolidate. Now, the EU is in turn saying that its member states are just restructuring their presence in order to face the new political situation. And it is reported that the EU bloc also intends to increase funding for African peace building missions across the continent. But I think that the truth is that both sides, both the EU and indeed African nations, potentially need each other equally. The world is massively interlinked nowadays over all sorts of issues, not least of all climate change and indeed security. And what happens in Africa can have an influence on what happens in Europe, for example, and the reverse is also the case. And I certainly think that everybody stands to lose from the current regime in Mali, for example. The junta came through a military coup, and the country is in an extremely unstable state at the moment.
You know, Nabila, quickly, if you can, there were also complaints about this meeting that it was unfairly weighted toward Francophone Africa. You know, France was kind of allowed, some said, to commandeer the meeting to suit its interests in its former colonies. It was even said that Anglophone and Lusophone states weren't even invited to the preparatory talks for this meeting. Does that show a failure in recognizing how important it is that everyone is included on an equal level?
Well, yes, indeed, and part of that has to do with the huge military presence of the French on the African continent. France has about 4,300 troops in the region, including 2,400 in Mali alone. And the so-called Barkhane force is also involved in Chad, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, and Mauritania. There's also a European Union contingent, the Takuba task force organized by France to back up its forces that will also be withdrawing from Mali now. And the French and African leaders, said that after the meeting at the Élysée Palace.
Okay. So it should be expected, in a sense, that part of the agenda was weighted toward Francophone countries on the continent.
Can I chip in here?
Alex, yes, go ahead. We actually have 1 minute left, and I did want to get your final thoughts. Go ahead.
So the summit was postponed twice because of COVID. It wasn't ever the intention to have it under the French presidency. The Germans were hoping for it, and the Portuguese presidency also. It's because of COVID. But you can't be surprised that since it did overlap with France, France is the country within the EU that has the deepest African interests. And so it tried to multilateralize its own strategic vision for Africa. And that's why it's got such a French flavor, this summit. Was
that at a cost of anyone else, or was it just fair and logical that it happened that way?
I don't actually think the Lusophones and Anglophones really suffered that much, but obviously the press announcement yesterday at the Elysee about the French reconfiguration of its security presence with the pulling out of Mali, obviously that's got conflated into the summit. And so this then gets a very Gaelic taste to it, which it wasn't meant to have had when it was first planned, this summit.
Okay, Alex, I'm going to have to give you the final word. So unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. So much more to talk about. But yeah, as always, the clock is against us. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists, Samake, Nabila Ramdani, and Alex Vines, for joining us. And our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.